Watch a rocket leave the ground and your eyes do something simple. They go up a small, violent light climbing away from the thing that made it, the way a struck match reads when you hold it still. It is the plainest direction there is, and for about a minute the launch lets you believe it. Then look at where the machines those rockets carried have actually spent the last 50 years. Voyager left. New Horizons left. Machines older than most living memories are past every planet right now, still sending back whispers that take a full day to arrive. Every one of them went out. Farther from the sun, along the same flat plane every planet already shares. Almost none of them went up. Off that plane entirely, the one direction that would let something look back and finally see the solar system the way a drone sees a table, from above, instead of the way an ant sees it, from the cloth. Exactly one spacecraft in the whole history of spaceflight has ever bent that far, and even it fell short of the full turn. Out has been routine for half a century. Up has been attempted once, at enormous cost, never repeated. Same launch pad. Same open sky. Two completely different bills. 5 serious explanations for why up has stayed almost impossible are about to get a fair hearing, one at a time. Not enough rocket, not enough fuel, a lopsided universe, bad aim, a borrowed push that never quite lines up. Each sounds complete. Each is wrong for a specific reason. Underneath all 5 sits the real answer. A debt every object born in this solar system has carried since before it had a name for what it was. If this is the kind of night you return to, subscribe. It helps this quiet universe keep growing. Let's begin. Here is the first thing that does not match the picture in your head. No rocket ever built goes straight up for very long. Watch the full flight, not just the first few seconds, and something happens that almost never makes it into the highlight reel. Within about the first minute or two of leaving the pad, every orbital rocket ever flown tips over. Deliberately. On purpose. By design. According to a flight plan written months in advance, engineers call it the pitch program, and it is not a malfunction or a correction. It is the entire point of the flight. Watch enough launch broadcasts, and the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Commentary continues describing altitude as the headline number climbing on screen, but a second number sitting quietly beside it. Velocity is the one actually racing ahead, the one every controller in the room is truly watching. Altitude was never the mission. It was only ever the first, most photogenic byproduct of a flight built entirely around velocity, in a direction the human eye was never built to expect. The rocket does not fight this tilt. It leans into it, more with each passing second, until what looks from the ground like an arc is really a steady, engineered surrender of verticality. By the time the first stage burns out and falls away, the vehicle is no longer climbing in any sense a hiker would recognize. It is moving mostly sideways, skimming the top of the atmosphere at a speed that would carry it once around the planet in about 90 minutes. Ask why, and the honest answer undercuts the vertical picture completely. Going up, on its own, does not get you anywhere useful. A rocket that burned every drop of its fuel traveling straight away from the ground would simply slow down, stop, and fall back to the exact spot it launched from, like a ball tossed at a ceiling. Height without sideways speed is not an achievement. It is a very expensive, very temporary delay of gravity. What actually works is stranger, and it is the reason every launch you have ever watched bends. This is not a quirk of one rocket family or one country's space program. Every orbital launch vehicle ever flown, from the first crude boosters of the 1950s to the reusable rockets landing themselves on drone ships today, pitches over in roughly the same way, because the physics leaves no alternative. A crew riding one of these flights would feel it directly. The press of the seat shifts from straight into their backs to increasingly across them, a sideways shove that keeps building as the vehicle trades altitude for the speed an orbit actually needs. Anyone who has watched a launch broadcast has seen the number on screen quietly do something odd during that stretch, altitude climbing more slowly than it did in the first seconds, while velocity keeps climbing fast. That mismatch, easy to miss if you are not looking for it, is the entire trick of the flight compressed into two changing numbers. Engineers do not hide this. It shows up in mission plans as plainly as anything else on the sheet. Described in the driest possible language. Pitch program, gravity turn, downrange trajectory. Nobody markets it that way. Because the rocket stops going up on purpose, does not sell tickets the way a column of fire does, but it is the entire reason the flight works. And it is the first clean piece of evidence that whatever up turns out to mean by the end of this hour, it will not be the direction painted on the side of the launch tower. An orbit is not an escape from gravity. It is a specific, continuous relationship with it, one that has a name most people learn as a fact and almost never picture as an event. Picture it anyway. Fire a cannonball horizontally from a very tall tower. It falls the way anything falls, curving toward the ground under the same pull that drops an apple. But the ground itself is curved, falling away from a straight line at roughly 5 meters for every 8 kilometers you travel across it. Fire the cannonball fast enough, and it falls at exactly the rate the ground drops away beneath it. It never gets closer. It never gets farther. It just keeps missing. That is what an orbit is. Not a victory over gravity, but a permanent, sideways moving freefall, matched so precisely to the curve of whatever you are circling that the two curves, your fall and the ground's retreat, never intersect. Every satellite over your head right now, every space station, every one of the thousands of pieces of tracked debris circling the planet is falling toward Earth at this exact moment, has been falling continuously since the day it launched, and will keep falling until something finally interrupts it. Nothing about this requires going up. It requires going sideways, fast. The specific sideways speed at which falling and missing become the same motion. Once a rocket has bled off its vertical climb into orbital sideways speed, up has already stopped being where the effort goes. The effort now has a direction, and that direction runs parallel to the ground, not away from it. The same relationship holds no matter what you are orbiting, or at what distance. The Moon orbits Earth in exactly this sense, falling continuously and missing continuously, at a speed of roughly 1 kilometer per second. Earth orbits the Sun the same way, falling toward it every instant and missing it every instant, at a considerably faster clip. Nothing up there has ever needed to defeat gravity. Every stable object in the solar system, including the ground under your own house, is quietly falling towards something bigger, all the time, and has been for as long as it has existed. What separates a falling ball from an orbiting satellite is not the presence of gravity. This is why a satellite never needs fuel simply to stay up once it has reached the right sideways speed for its altitude. It is not hovering, and it is not resisting anything. It is falling, endlessly, along a path that happens to curve at exactly the rate the planet beneath it curves away. A balance so stable that some satellites have circled Earth for decades without a single correction to the basic fact of their fall, which raises the real question of this hour. And it is a stranger one than, can we escape gravity? We already know the answer to that. The ships have already gone. The question that has almost no plain answer is what happens to a launch that is not trying to fall around a planet or a star at all, but is trying to leave the flat, spinning plane every one of those falls has always taken place inside. Notice what has quietly happened to the word up over the last few minutes. It started tonight, meaning away from the ground, the direction of the rocket's smoke trail. the direction of a thrown ball before gravity wins. It has already been replaced, without asking permission, by sideways, the direction every successful launch actually spends its fuel chasing. If a word that ordinary can shift its entire meaning between the first sentence of a flight and its last, it is worth asking, carefully, what else about up might not survive contact with how the solar system actually behaves. There is a fact worth sitting with before going further, because it will do most of the work of the next 2 hours by itself, once it is stated plainly. Humanity has already sent hardware outward, past every planet, past the edge of where the sun's light meaningfully reaches, into the dark between stars. That direction farther from the sun, along the same flat plane every planet already orbits inside, has been open, tested, and successfully used since the 1970s. Almost nothing has ever gone the other direction. Not farther. Up. Out of that plane entirely. The direction that would let something look back and see the solar system the way a drone sees a dinner table, from above, rather than the way an ant sees it, from the tablecloth. Say it side by side, and the shape of the paradox becomes visible. Outward has been routine for half a century. Perpendicular, truly up, off the flat disk, everything else lives inside, has been attempted, carefully, exactly once, and even that one attempt never managed the whole 90 degrees. 2 directions, both starting from the same launch pad, both facing what looks like the same open sky. One of them is a bus route, the other is a locked door that has been opened a crack a single time by an enormous amount of borrowed effort. Picture the solar system, the way its own physics actually built it. Not a sphere of scattered planets, but something closer to a phonograph record or a plate spinning on a fingertip, the sun at the center, and every planet, nearly every moon, nearly every asteroid and comet nucleus, confined to a disk so thin that, scaled to the size of an actual vinyl record, the vertical thickness of the plane of the solar system would be thinner than the record's own grooves. You have spent your entire life, and so has everyone you have ever known, standing on a speck embedded in that thin plate. Up, from where you are standing, does not mean away from the ground. It means off the record entirely. Most planetary science documentaries never need to make this distinction, because almost nothing they discuss requires it. A mission to Mars, to Jupiter, to a comet, to interstellar space. Every one of those destinations sits inside the same thin plate you already occupy. At a different radius, but the same tilt. Reaching them is a matter of speed and patience, both of which engineering has solved again and again since the middle of the 20th century. The moment a mission instead tries to leave that plate, not farther out along it, but off it, at a right angle to everything else that has ever been launched. The entire toolkit that made Mars and Jupiter and interstellar space reachable stops applying. That is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind, and almost nobody watching a rocket liftoff ever gets told which kind of trip it is making. That is the direction tonight is actually about. Not escaping the sun's pull. That particular door has already been opened, more than once. The door that is almost impossible to open is the one perpendicular to everything you have ever orbited inside. Say the 2 directions in the plainest terms available, because the rest of this hour will keep returning to exactly this distinction. Outward means farther from the sun, still inside the family of orbits every planet already shares. A direction so rarely attempted that most people, including many who follow space exploration closely, have never had reason to separate it from outward at all. The physics treats them as almost unrelated problems. The instinctive answer to, "Why haven't we gone up?" then, arrives almost before the question finishes being asked. And it borrows directly from the rocket launch that opened this hour. Going up must simply cost more. More fuel, more thrust, more of whatever climbing a mountain costs compared to walking across a field, just scaled up to the size of a solar system. It is a reasonable guess, and it is built on real experience. Climbing genuinely does cost more than walking. In a straightforward muscle and oxygen sense, going higher into Earth's atmosphere costs more fuel than staying low, for exactly that reason. You are working against gravity the whole way, and gravity does not offer refunds. If the solar system worked the same way, going up out of its plane would simply be the same problem at a larger scale. More distance from the massive thing at the center, more fuel spent fighting its pull, a bigger version of a hill. That guess is about to run into the same wall the straight-up rocket ran into 2 chapters ago. It assumes that direction, by itself, sets the price of a trip through space. That up is expensive for the same reason a mountain is expensive. Because you are moving away from something heavy. The mountain analogy feels airtight because it has never once been tested against how orbits actually behave. This particular assumption survives so easily for a reason that has nothing to do with carelessness. Nearly every intuition a person carries about motion was built on a planet's surface, where gravity acts on you directly and constantly, where friction and air resistance quietly do most of the work of stopping things, and where away from the heavy object and against the pull really do mean the same thing. None of those 3 conditions hold once an object is already coasting through space, already falling in the specific, curved, endlessly missing sense the last chapter described. The mountain analogy is not stupid. It is simply borrowed from the wrong environment, the way a sailor's instincts for wind sometimes fail them the first time they try to fly a small plane. It is about to be tested here, against the first of 5 explanations that sound complete right up until the moment they are checked. Each one a serious, honest attempt at the same question. Why haven't we gone up? And each one failing for a specific, nameable reason rather than being waved away. One of them will fail for a reason that has nothing to do with numbers at all, and everything to do with what a person standing at a console would actually be able to do. None of the 5 is a straw man set up to be knocked down easily. Every one of them has, at some point, been a real working assumption inside the space program, in one form or another, before evidence closed it off. Start with the simplest one, because it is the one almost everyone reaches for first, and the one that is easiest to check against machines already flying. A particular discipline is worth naming in testing the easy explanation first, even when it feels almost too obvious to bother with. Skipping straight to the strangest, most satisfying answer is tempting, and it is exactly how casual explanations of hard problems usually go wrong. Reaching for the version that sounds most dramatic instead of the version that is actually next in line to be checked. This hour is going to resist that temptation on purpose, testing each explanation in the order a careful engineer would, rather than the order that makes the best story. The simplest explanation is also the most flattering one, because it does not require rethinking anything. Maybe going up simply demands more raw power than any engine we have built. Rockets are, after all, machines with hard limits. A certain amount of fuel, a certain amount of thrust, a certain maximum speed each stage can hand to the next. It would not be strange if one particular direction turned out to sit just beyond what current engineering can deliver. The way a very tall building sits beyond what a person can jump. It is a fair guess, and for a while, it might even feel airtight, because most people have no working sense of how much speed a rocket can actually hand a spacecraft. Say only that leaving the solar system takes enormous speed, and the claim that we simply cannot generate enough of it sounds entirely plausible. Nobody has an intuitive yardstick for kilometers per second the way they do for kilometers per hour on a highway. The claim survives for exactly as long as it takes to check it against machines already in flight, and it does not survive long. Voyager 1, launched in 1977, is moving away from the Sun faster than the speed required to leave the solar system entirely from its own position. It is not falling back, and it never will. New Horizons, launched in 2006 on a fast, direct trajectory to Pluto, left Earth faster than any spacecraft before it, and continues outward, passed the solar escape speed for its distance as well. Both machines prove, by simply continuing to exist and continuing to recede, that humanity has had engineering capable of exceeding solar system escape speed for decades. If raw power were the obstacle, neither spacecraft should be out there right now, still transmitting, still outrunning the sun's pull along the direction that has always been open. They are, which means whatever makes up so difficult, it is not a shortage of horsepower. Something else is doing the blocking, and it is not obvious yet what that something is. It helps to say plainly what enough power actually looks like in practice, rather than leaving it as a vague sense of impressiveness. Both spacecraft reached their final trajectories using chemical rockets, not fundamentally different in principle from the ones that first reached orbit in the late 1950s, boosted further by the same gravity assist technique this hour keeps returning to. Nothing about their propulsion required a technology that did not already exist decades earlier. The ceiling this explanation imagined simply was not where it predicted. There is something almost unfair about how easily this first explanation falls, and it is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than rushing past it. It is not every day that a guess this reasonable gets knocked down by a machine that has been quietly doing the opposite of what the guess predicted for nearly 50 years, in near silence, long past the point anyone expected it to still be listening. Voyager 1 left Earth the same year a great many of its current ground controllers were born. It is still going, still faster than it needs to be to leave, and it never once had to fight the direction the rest of this hour is actually about. Put the two spacecraft side by side, and the picture sharpens further. New Horizons left Earth faster than anything launched before it, on a trajectory built to reach Pluto in barely 9 years, rather than the decades a gentler path would have required. Both machines share one thing in common that matters here. Neither one ever needed to cancel the sideways speed. Earth handed them at launch. They kept it, added to it, and let it carry them out. That detail, kept, not cancelled, is about to become the whole story. Retreat one step, and the explanation sharpens instead of collapsing entirely. Maybe the issue was never raw thrust, but the fuel bill. Every kilogram of propellant a rocket carries is a kilogram it must first lift off the ground, which means every extra kilogram of fuel demands still more fuel just to carry the fuel, a compounding cost that grows brutally fast. The reason a moon rocket is a skyscraper and the payload that actually reaches the moon is the size of a small room. Maybe up is not blocked by weak engines. Maybe it is blocked by a fuel tank that would have to be too large to ever leave the ground in the first place. This version of the explanation is harder to dismiss, because the compounding cost of carrying fuel is real, well understood, and genuinely brutal at the extremes. It has a name, the rocket equation, and it has ended entire mission concepts on paper before a single bolt was cut. For exactly this reason, it still fails. And it fails for a reason that is almost the opposite of "we cannot afford the fuel." Engineers have spent half a century finding ways to avoid paying that fuel bill in the first place, and the results are already flying. Voyager did not carry anywhere near the propellant a direct, fuel-only trip to interstellar space would require. Instead, its planners used a rare alignment of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune to let the spacecraft swing past each giant planet in turn, borrowing a small slice of each planet's own orbital momentum for free. The way a skateboarder grabs a moving truck's bumper to pick up speed without pedaling. A modest launch, multiplied 4 times by planets that never build it a single drop of propellant, is what actually put Voyager on an interstellar trajectory. So the fuel shortage explanation collapses the same way the power shortage one did, just one layer deeper. It is not that missions cannot afford the fuel for ambitious trips outward. Engineering already learned, decades ago, how to borrow that fuel from planets instead of tanks. Whatever keeps up out of reach, it has survived 2 of the most obvious explanations intact. Consider how differently this reads once the rocket equation's real bite is understood rather than just named. Every extra kilogram of propellant needed to reach a given speed requires still more propellant to lift that propellant off the ground, compounding exponentially rather than in a straight line, which is exactly why a moonbound rocket in the 1960s stood over 100 meters tall to deliver a return capsule the size of a car. If a direction genuinely required carrying that much more fuel than any other, the compounding alone would make it look impossible, long before anyone reached for gravity assists as an alternative. That it was not the fuel that closed this door is itself informative. It means whatever blocks up survives even after the most brutal cost in ordinary rocketry has already been worked around. Notice, too, what both failed explanations have quietly agreed on without ever saying so: that the problem, if it exists, must be a problem of degree. More power, more fuel, more of something a rocket already has some of. Voyager's 4-planet tour proves that assumption wrong twice over. It proves engineering can supply enormous amounts of both power and effective fuel through borrowed momentum when a mission actually needs them. And it proves that supply was aimed deliberately and successfully at a completely different direction than the one under question here. Outward, along the plane, planet after planet, never once upward, off it. To see why that particular aim was chosen, and never the other one, the next question has to stop asking about power or fuel altogether, and start asking what a trip through space actually costs, measured in the only currency that matters out there. Every trip through space, no matter how far, prices itself the same peculiar way. Not in kilometers, but in how much your speed has to change, and in which direction. That statement sounds abstract until you notice how differently it behaves from a trip on the ground. Driving somewhere twice as far normally costs roughly twice the fuel. In space, distance by itself is almost free. A spacecraft coasting between planets burns no fuel at all for the empty kilometers in between, because nothing is slowing it down. The entire bill for a space mission gets paid at the handful of moments when its velocity actually has to change. Leaving one orbit, entering another, turning a straight coast into a curve, or a curve into a straight coast. Coast 1 billion kilometers, and the meter does not move. Change your speed by 1 kilometer per second, and it does, every time, regardless of whether that change happens near Earth or near Neptune. Engineers gave this currency a name, delta V, literally change in velocity. And they budget every mission against it the way a household budgets against money rather than against miles driven. A trip's delta V budget does not care where you are going. It only cares how much your velocity has to be rearranged to get there. Which is why two destinations that look wildly different from a map can cost nearly the same, and two destinations that look almost identical on a map can cost wildly different amounts. This is why mission planners talk in kilometers per second long before they talk in kilometers, and why a spacecraft's fuel tank is sized against a delta V budget worked out on paper years before launch, not against the raw distance the mission will eventually cover. Get the budget wrong, even by a small margin, and there is no refueling stop waiting along the way to make up the difference. Every mission ever flown carries this budget the way a traveler carries a fixed amount of money for a trip with no cash machines along the route. Spend too much on an early, avoidable maneuver, and there is nothing left for the one that actually matters later. This is precisely why mission designers obsess over which direction costs what, long before a single line of the flight plan is finalized, because the budget, once set, cannot be renegotiated once the spacecraft is already in flight. This is the piece every earlier explanation missed. Not enough rocket was really a claim about raw thrust. Not enough fuel was really a claim about total mass. Neither one asked the only question that actually determines the price of a direction. How much does this specific trip need your velocity to change? And does the universe hand you any of that change for free? Think of it the way a long trip by car prices itself once you strip away the scenery. Not by the miles on the map, but by every time you have to brake hard and accelerate again. A straight highway drive can cover 1,000 kilometers, on very little fuel relative to its distance, because the car's speed barely changes the whole way. A short trip through a city full of stop signs can burn a surprising amount of fuel over a few kilometers, because the car's speed keeps getting cancelled and rebuilt. Space works the same way, except every stop sign is a deliberate engine burn, and every one of them appears on the same bill, however small the distance being crossed. Delta V sounds like it belongs to engineers alone, but the idea underneath it is simple enough to hold in 5 plain pieces, none of which requires a single symbol or equation, and none of which needs to be remembered for long after the 5th one lands. First, every object moving through space already has a velocity, a speed, and a direction. Whether it got that velocity from a rocket engine, from a planet's rotation, or simply from being born spinning inside a cloud of gas billions of years ago. Nothing in space is ever truly still, and nothing starts a trip from zero. Every mission begins already moving, whether its planners think about that fact or not. Second, getting anywhere different means changing that velocity. And the size of the change is what the mission actually pays for, not the distance covered afterward. A trip that ends far away but requires almost no change in speed or direction can be nearly free. A trip that ends nearby but demands a total reversal of course can be the most expensive maneuver a mission ever attempts. Third, some changes are cheap because they are small, nudging an orbit slightly higher, adjusting an approach by a few degrees. The kind of correction a spacecraft makes routinely without anyone on the ground losing sleep over the fuel gauge. Fourth, some changes are staggeringly expensive because they are large, reversing a direction entirely or stopping something that was moving very fast. The way stopping a train costs far more than nudging its throttle. Here is the 5th piece, and it is the only one this episode actually needs. So it is worth saying slowly, on its own, with nothing competing for attention around it. Cancelling a speed you already have costs exactly as much as adding a brand new one of the same size. Physics keeps no separate, cheaper ledger for slowing down versus speeding up. A change from 30 kilometers per second to 0 costs the same as a change from 0 to 30 kilometers per second in the opposite direction. Subtraction is not a discount. It is the same bill presented in reverse, and no mission planner has ever found a loophole in it. Nobody needs to hold all 5 pieces in mind at once to feel why this last one matters. And that is rather the point of laying them out this way. Each piece stands on its own, and only the last one needs to be carried forward. It means that a spacecraft's problem is never really, how do I get there? It is how much of my current velocity has to be undone or redirected before I can start going somewhere else instead. And that undoing is billed in full, every single time, with no exceptions for direction, no discount for familiarity, and no forgiveness for velocity that was never asked for in the first place. It is worth pausing on how quietly this reframes everything asked so far. Not enough rocket assumed the problem was adding speed. Not enough fuel assumed the problem was carrying enough mass to add that speed. Neither one ever considered that a mission might need to spend just as much effort taking speed away, and that this, not any shortage of power or propellant, might be exactly where up runs into trouble. Carry that one sentence forward, because it is about to explain something that neither weak engines nor expensive fuel ever could. Engineers do not find this 5th piece surprising, even though almost no one outside the field has reason to have encountered it before. It follows from nothing more exotic than the way velocity itself works. A change from one speed to another is a single quantity, indifferent to which of the 2 speeds came first. The universe keeps no ledger of starting speeds versus ending speeds, only of how far apart they are. Everything built so far tonight, and everything still to come, rests on that one piece of arithmetic, holding true without exception. A third explanation waits underneath the first 2, and it takes a different shape entirely. Maybe the problem is not effort at all, but geometry. Maybe the sun's pull, so reliable at holding planets in their familiar, flat arrangement, simply does not extend the same way perpendicular to that arrangement. The way a magnet's field is strongest along certain lines and weaker off to the side, if gravity itself were thinner in the up direction, nothing stable could exist up there to aim for, no matter how much speed a spacecraft carried. It is an appealing idea precisely because the solar system does look lopsided at a glance. Every planet, every large moon, nearly every asteroid sits inside that thin, disc-shaped region. If almost nothing occupies the space above and below the disk, perhaps that emptiness reflects a real weakness in the pull itself, rather than mere habit or coincidence. This is the one explanation on the list that a single fact from basic physics closes immediately, without needing a spacecraft to prove it. Gravity from a compact, massive body like the Sun spreads outward equally in every direction. The technical description is a central force, meaning its strength depends only on distance from the center, never on direction. A ball dropped beside the Sun would fall toward it exactly as fast whether it started directly above the solar poles, off to the side in the familiar plane, or anywhere in between. There is no weak side to a star's gravity. There never has been. There is a way to feel this, instead of just being told it. Imagine standing at the center of a perfectly round room, holding a leash attached to a ball rolling around you in a circle. Swing that leash toward the far wall, then swing it toward the ceiling instead. The tension in your hand does not change with the direction you choose. The leash pulls exactly as hard no matter which way the ball happens to be circling. Gravity behaves the same way around the Sunday. Nothing about the pull cares whether the object it is holding onto happens to be circling in the familiar plane of the planets or looping far above it. The leash has no favorite direction, and neither does the Sunday. This is worth stating even more plainly, because the plainness is exactly the point. Measure the Sun's gravitational pull on an object directly above its north pole at some given distance, and then measure the pull on an identical object at the same distance but sitting in the familiar plane of the planets. The two measurements come back identical, to every decimal place instruments can reach. Nothing about the equation governing gravity contains a term for direction relative to the disk. It only ever asks for distance. So the emptiness above and below the plane was never gravity refusing to hold anything there. It is something closer to the opposite. A region gravity is fully prepared to hold objects in, that simply never received any objects to hold because nothing in the solar system's history ever put material there in the first place. That distinction a region gravity ignores versus a region history never populated turns out to matter more than it sounds like it should, and the next few chapters will show exactly why. A satellite could, in principle, orbit the Sun on a path tilted 90 degrees to every planet, held in place by exactly the same gravity holding Earth in its own familiar lane. Nothing in the law of gravity forbids that orbit from existing stably, indefinitely, the same way any other orbit does. The reason so few objects actually occupy such a path has nothing to do with whether gravity would support them there. It has everything to do with how expensive it is to put anything there in the first place, which is precisely the question the rest of this hour is built to answer. If gravity is not the reason nothing much exists above and below the plane, something else put it there and kept it there. The next question is not about the Sun's pull at all. It is about what a rocket does with the velocity gravity leaves alone. The fourth explanation is the one that survives longest in casual conversation, because it sounds almost embarrassingly simple. Has anyone actually tried just aiming the rocket that way? Point the nose straight up, off the plane of the planets, light the engines, and go. If gravity pulls the same in every direction, and engines clearly have enough power, surely pointing is the only step left. Try to picture it carefully though, and a detail creeps in that the simple version leaves out entirely. The rocket is not starting from rest. It is standing on a planet that is itself moving at every moment at close to 30 kilometers per second around the Sunday, carrying the launch pad, the fuel, and the rocket along with it before a single engine has fired. Pointing the nose in a new direction changes where the engine's thrust gets added. It does nothing at all to the velocity the rocket already has. Inherited the instant it left the ground still attached to a moving planet. A small, almost domestic experiment makes this vivid without needing a single equation. Stand inside a train moving smoothly down the tracks and throw a ball straight up, as hard and as precisely vertical as you can manage. It does not fall behind you, out the back of the car, the way it would if the train's motion somehow did not belong to it. It comes back down to the same hand that threw it, because the ball never stopped sharing the train's forward speed. Throwing it up only ever added a new, separate motion on top of a speed it could not simply opt out of. A rocket aimed perpendicular to the solar system's plane is that ball, and Earth is the train, moving at a speed no amount of careful aiming ever cancels. This is the explanation that dies by objection rather than by number, and it is worth marking it as such, because it is the only one of the 5 that does. No measurement proves it wrong. A moment of honest imagination does. The same way picturing the thrown ball on the train settles the question faster than any formula could. It is worth being fair to the intuition before leaving it behind, because it is not a foolish one. On the ground, pointing genuinely does determine where something ends up. A thrown ball, a fired arrow, a car pulling out of a driveway all go where their nose was aimed. More or less, that rule holds so reliably in ordinary life that almost nobody has reason to question it before encountering a rocket already moving at orbital speed before its own engine ever fires. The rule is not wrong. It simply stops applying the instant the thing being aimed is already inheriting a velocity of its own on top of whatever the aiming adds. Pointing was never the missing step. The missing step is dealing with the speed that was already there before the rocket pointed anywhere at all. And that speed deserves a number of its own, because right now it is still an abstraction. And abstractions are exactly what let intuitions like this one survive as long as they do. This particular misunderstanding is so persistent for a reason worth naming honestly, rather than treating it as simple carelessness. Nearly every video, diagram, and animation of a rocket launch frames the vehicle against a fixed background. The launch tower, the horizon, the curve of the Earth. As if that background were standing still. It never is, rendering the scene from a genuinely fixed point in space, rather than from the moving planet's own surface, would show both the rocket and the tower it left already streaking sideways together before the engines ever fired. No diagram most people have ever seen makes that motion visible, so intuition never has reason to include it. Put a number on the speed that keeps quietly refusing to be pointed away, because it deserves to stop being an abstraction and start being something you can hold. Earth travels around the Sun at just under 30 kilometers per second. The precise figure is close to 29.8. That speed is not something Earth chose or something a launch adds. It is simply how fast a planet at this particular distance from the Sun has to move to keep missing it, in exactly the falling and missing sense from earlier in this hour. Every person, every building, every launch pad, every rocket sitting fueled on that pad shares that speed automatically, all the time, without ever feeling it. The same way you do not feel Earth's rotation while sitting still in a chair. Give the number a body. 30 kilometers per second would carry something from New York to Los Angeles in under 2 minutes. It would circle the entire Earth roughly every 22 minutes. If nothing were in the way, it is roughly 90 times faster than a rifle bullet leaving the barrel. That is the speed already built into every object standing anywhere on this planet's surface. This instant, whether or not anyone is preparing to launch it anywhere at all, this is the speed a rocket aimed up would need to deal with, not add to deal with, before its own engines could contribute anything toward a genuinely perpendicular path. It did not arrive as an obstacle a mission chose to take on. It arrived as an inheritance, the moment the rocket was built on a planet that already had it. Other planets carry their own version of this same inheritance, scaled to their own distance from the Sunday. Mercury, tucked in close, moves at just over 47 kilometers per second to keep from falling in. Neptune, far out at the edge of the traditionally recognized planets, manages with barely more than 5. The pattern holds everywhere. Closer to the Sun means a faster sideways speed is required just to keep missing it, and farther out means a slower one suffices. Earth's number, close to 30, is simply where that sliding scale happens to land at exactly the distance where liquid water and everything that depends on it became possible. None of these speeds were assigned by choice or convenience. Each one is fixed by the same relationship between distance and the Sun's pull that governs every orbit described so far, which means a mission's own inherited speed is entirely a function of where it starts. A spacecraft launched from a hypothetical outpost near Neptune would inherit barely a sixth of the sideways speed Earth hands its own launches, a detail that matters enormously for any future mission choosing where its journey up might someday begin. There is something almost personal in that word, inheritance. Nobody launching a rocket ever decided to give it 30 kilometers per second of sideways motion. Nobody could have decided otherwise, either. Refusing the inheritance was never on the table, any more than a person standing still in a room can refuse to be carried along by Earth's own rotation and orbit at the same time. Every calculation walked through so far, every candidate explanation tested and set aside, has been circling this one plain fact from a slightly different angle. Speed a body did not choose is still speed. A mission has to pay for, in full, the moment it decides to travel anywhere that speed does not already point toward. That is not a footnote. It is close to the whole answer, arriving several chapters before the ending is allowed to say so out loud. Line up what the last several chapters have actually established, because together they change the shape of the question being asked. Pointing the rocket differently does not remove the sideways speed it already owns. Gravity pulls the same in every direction, so there is no direction where the pull conveniently weakens to make the job easier. Whatever sets the price of up, it is not aim, and it is not a lopsided universe. What is left is the fifth piece from 2 chapters back, arriving now to do its actual work. Cancelling a speed costs exactly as much as adding one of the same size. Every object launched from Earth carries close to 30 kilometers per second of speed it never asked for and cannot point away. Leaving the solar system outward, in the direction Voyager and New Horizons already went, barely touches that inherited speed. It uses it the way a diver uses the push of the board rather than fighting it. Leaving perpendicular to it means cancelling most of that 30 kilometers per second first, before a single kilometer of up progress can even begin. That is the bigger bill this whole hour has been building toward. Up is not expensive because it goes far. It is expensive because it demands giving back a speed every launch is handed for free the moment it leaves a spinning planet. And giving back is never the cheap half of the transaction. Compare it once more against the direction that already works, because the contrast is where the strangeness actually lives. Voyager and New Horizons never had to argue with their inherited 30 kilometers per second. They used it, folded it directly into their outward trajectories the way a sailor uses a current rather than rowing against it. A mission aimed the other way cannot use that same speed at all. It has to unwind it kilometer per second by kilometer per second before its own engines can even begin contributing toward the direction it actually wants to go. Same inheritance, same 30 kilometers per second, and yet one direction turns it into a free ride, while the other turns it into the largest single expense on the entire bill. One resource in the solar system has repeatedly proven capable of handling bills this large without asking a spacecraft's fuel tank to cover them. It is worth asking, honestly, whether that same resource could be turned against this particular debt. It is a fair question to ask precisely because it has already worked once, spectacularly, on a bill that looked just as intimidating. Nobody paid Voyager's outward escape in raw propellant. Jupiter and Saturn paid most of it. For free. Simply by being enormous and being in the right place at the right time. If a planet's gravity could erase most of the cost of leaving the solar system altogether, the next honest question is whether some planet, somewhere, could erase most of the cost of leaving the plane instead, using exactly the same trick, turned in a different direction. It also matters that this candidate, unlike the first four, is not being proposed from ignorance of how the solar system actually works. Whoever raises it already understands velocity budgets, already understands that gravity assists are real and enormously powerful, and is asking a genuinely sophisticated question. If one form of borrowing solved one debt, why not the other? That is exactly the kind of question worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, and exactly the kind that requires an honest look at where the available lenders actually live. One resource dealt with two of the earlier obstacles almost effortlessly. Other planets. Jupiter and Saturn handed Voyager free momentum, planet after planet, letting a modest launch become an interstellar trajectory without paying for that momentum in propellant. If planets can hand a spacecraft speed for free in one direction, the fifth and final explanation asks a fair question. Could a planet hand a spacecraft the opposite kind of gift, cancelling sideways speed instead of adding it, and finally open the door up for less than the full price? It is the most sophisticated of the five explanations because it is built on a technique that genuinely works, applied to a genuinely different problem. A gravity assist bends a spacecraft's path by trading a tiny, physically negligible sliver of a planet's own orbital momentum for a large change in the spacecraft's velocity. Free, in the sense that no propellant is burned, but not free in a deeper sense, because it depends entirely on the spacecraft arriving at the right place, at the right angle, at the right moment, relative to a planet whose own path is quietly given ahead of time. That last requirement is exactly where the explanation runs into trouble. Every planet capable of delivering a serious gravity assist orbits inside the same thin, flat disk this whole episode has already described. The same plane a spacecraft is trying to leave. A flyby that reroutes a spacecraft sideways or outward within that plane has abundant opportunities because the planets themselves already move within it. A flyby engineered to cancel a spacecraft's sideways speed and redirect it perpendicular out of the plane entirely needs a very particular geometry that the planets essentially never offer for free, because they, too, are relentlessly confined to the same flat arrangement everything else in this episode keeps returning to. There is a way to picture exactly why the geometry fails without needing an orbital mechanics textbook. Imagine a row of merry-go-rounds, all spinning in the same flat plane, side by side. Jumping from one spinning platform to the next, timed correctly, can easily add speed in the direction they are all already spinning. That is the Grand Tour. Planet handing spacecraft to planet, all within the same plane. Now imagine trying to use one of those same merry-go-rounds to launch yourself straight up over everyone's heads, cancelling your own sideways motion in the process. The platforms were never built to hand out that kind of push. Nothing about their spin naturally converts into a shove perpendicular to the ground they are all spinning across. The precision this requires is worth appreciating on its own terms. Separate from the direction problem, every gravity assist ever flown depended on a spacecraft arriving at a specific point in space, within a window measured in minutes, meeting a planet that was itself following a schedule fixed by its own orbit years in advance. Missing that window even slightly turns a free, elegant maneuver into a wasted flyby and a mission that must find an entirely different, usually far more expensive, way home. Borrowing momentum has never been a casual favor. It has always been a precisely booked appointment. Borrowing a push works beautifully for going farther out. It very nearly never works for going up, for a reason that has nothing to do with engineering skill and everything to do with where the available planets happen to live. To see why they all live there together, in that same thin plane, requires going back much further than any spacecraft. back to before the planets existed at all. The flatness of the solar system is not an accident of where the planets happen to end up. It is close to the only shape available to the cloud of gas and dust that became the Sun and everything orbiting it roughly 4.5 billion years ago. Picture a large, slowly spinning ball of pizza dough tossed gently into the air. Left alone, gravity would simply pull such a cloud straight inward, collapsing it into a small, dense clump. But the cloud that became the solar system was already turning, however slightly, and a spinning object resists collapsing evenly in every direction the way a still one would. As the dough spins faster, it does not stay a ball. It flattens, spreading outward along the direction of its spin, while collapsing much faster along the axis running through the middle, the same way that same dough flattens into a disc the instant a pizza maker sends it spinning into the air. The same shape emerged from the same cause on a far larger scale. As the solar nebula contracted under its own gravity, a quantity physicists call angular momentum. Roughly, a measure of how much spin an object carries and how far that spin is distributed from its center, had nowhere to go. It could not simply vanish. So the collapsing cloud kept spinning as it shrank, spinning faster as it drew inward the same way a skater spins faster by pulling in their arms, and that spin flattened it into the thin, wide disk that every planet, without exception, eventually condensed out of. Nothing since then has undone that shape. Nearly every planet, nearly every large moon, nearly every asteroid and comet nucleus still orbits within a few degrees of that original disk, because they inherited both their positions and their motion directly from the flattened cloud that built them. The disk was never a coincidence. It was close to the only shape a spinning, collapsing cloud could have produced. And it is the same disk every gravity assist in the last chapter turned out to be trapped inside. This is also where the 30 kilometers per second from several chapters back finally gets an origin story. Rather than simply being a number to memorize, Earth did not decide to move sideways around the Sun at that particular speed. It inherited that motion directly from the spin of the flattened cloud it condensed out of, the same way every planet inherited its own characteristic orbital speed from the same source. You did not choose your inherited sideways speed any more than Earth did. It was baked in, kilometer per second, before the planet under your feet had even finished forming. The same collapsing and flattening process explains something else already leaned on without naming its cause. Why the giant planets, Jupiter especially, ended up so much more massive than everything else. Material further from the young sun's fierce early heat could hold on to lighter gases that boiled away closer in, letting the outer disk sweep up far more mass over time. The same disk that confined every planet to one thin plane also happened to concentrate the most gravity, by a wide margin, in exactly the planet that would later prove essential for bending a trajectory out of it. Every gravity assist, every planetary alignment, every trajectory described so far has been playing out entirely within that one flattened disk. Because that disk is the only place any of the raw material for planets, or gravity assists, or launch pads ever ended up. The next chapter puts an exact number on how much that shape costs anyone trying to leave it from the side no launch has ever been designed to use. Put the two directions side by side once more, now with real numbers standing behind them instead of impressions. Leaving the solar system outward, along the plane, starting from Earth's own orbit, requires reaching a little over 42 kilometers per second relative to the Sun day, the speed at which the Sun's pull can no longer call something back at Earth's distance from it. That sounds enormous until it is compared against what a launch already owns for free. Nearly 30 kilometers per second, inherited automatically from Earth's own motion, available to any spacecraft launched in the same direction. Subtract what is already free from what is required, and the genuinely new speed a mission has to supply, in this simplified accounting, comes to a little over 12 kilometers per second. Substantial, but squarely within what modern rockets and gravity assists have delivered again and again since the 1970s. Leaving the plane entirely tells a very different story with the same arithmetic. To travel perpendicular to the disk rather than along it, a spacecraft first has to give back most of the 30 kilometers per second of sideways motion it was handed at launch, because that speed points in exactly the wrong direction for a genuinely vertical departure. Only after that speed is substantially cancelled does any new perpendicular motion even begin to count. The bill for cancelling it runs close to the same 30 kilometers per second the mission received for free. Except this time, receiving it is not a gift, it is the debt. Compare the two final numbers honestly, in the same simplified, idealized accounting used above rather than the messier real numbers. Any actual mission would have to fight through launch losses and trajectory design a little over 12 kilometers per second to leave the solar system outward, versus something close to 30 to leave it perpendicular. Outward is cheaper than perpendicular by a wide, uncomfortable margin. Not because outward is a smaller journey, but because outward is the one direction that lets a launch keep the speed it was born with, instead of forcing it to pay that speed back in full before the real trip can even begin. Say the comparison a different way, because the numbers alone can slide past without registering how strange the result actually is. Leaving the entire solar system behind, crossing the orbits of every planet, outrunning the sun's pull permanently, becoming a genuinely interstellar object the way Voyager 1 already has, costs less, in this idealized reckoning, than simply turning 90 degrees and climbing directly away from the plane every planet shares. Distance is not the expensive part of a solar system. Direction is. A destination billions of kilometers away, in the right direction, can be cheaper than a destination far closer, in the wrong one. Here, finally, is the piece that answers what the earlier candidates could not. It was never a shortage of rocket power. Voyager and New Horizons already prove otherwise. It was never a shortage of fuel. Gravity assists already solved that, for the direction they were aimed at. It was never a lopsided universe. Gravity pulls the same everywhere. It was never simply a matter of pointing. A rocket cannot aim away a velocity it was born with. And it was never a matter of borrowing a planet's push. The planets capable of the biggest pushes all live inside the very plane a perpendicular mission is trying to escape. Every one of those explanations circled the same underlying fact without quite naming it. Cancelling an inherited sideways speed is the single most expensive thing anyone can ask a spacecraft to do. And up, defined honestly as perpendicular to the disk every planet was born inside, asks for almost nothing else. Say the comparison once more. Because a number this counterintuitive deserves to be heard twice before moving on. 12 kilometers per second buys passage clear out of the solar system, past every planet, into the space between stars. 30 kilometers per second buys, at best, a partial climb above the disk those same planets share. And even that partial climb has been managed only once, by borrowing help from the single largest available lender in the entire system. That comparison lands with the satisfying click of a solved problem. And for a moment, it feels like the whole question has closed. Up costs more than out. The numbers say so plainly, and the reason traces cleanly back through gravity assists, through the flattened disk, through the inherited 30 kilometers per second every launch carries without asking for it. Case closed, Door explained. Nothing left hanging. Except knowing the price of a locked door has never once explained why nobody bothered picking the lock. Plenty of expensive things get built anyway, observatories costing billions. Telescopes launched to distances that took a decade to reach. Missions justified by nothing more than the value of a single, clear answer. A price this well understood, sitting on paper for decades, should have tempted somebody eventually. The way Everest tempted climbers long after the danger of the climb was already common knowledge. So, the honest version of this chapter is smaller than it looks. The arithmetic explains why up is expensive. It does not yet explain whether anyone ever tried to pay that price anyway, and, if they did, what actually happened when they attempted it. Notice, too, how completely different this final shape is from the 4 explanations that came before it. Each of those was a claim about a missing resource. Enough thrust, enough fuel, enough favorable geometry, enough correct aim, and each collapsed the moment a real spacecraft's numbers were checked against it. The price gap between outward and upward is not a missing resource. It is an accounting fact, true regardless of engineering cleverness. The same way a debt does not disappear simply because the debtor is skilled. That distinction is why this explanation, alone among the 5, survives every test the others failed. No amount of future engineering makes this one obsolete. Either the way better rockets eventually made the power and fuel objections obsolete, a faster rocket still inherits the same sideways speed. A cheaper rocket still has to cancel just as much of it to go up. This is the one candidate on the list that money and cleverness cannot simply engineer around. A particular kind of quiet settles over a good explanation right before it turns out to be incomplete. Everything checks out. The physics holds together. The numbers behave exactly as predicted. And yet a question as old and as human as "Has anyone ever actually gone up there?" refuses to be answered by an equation alone, no matter how correct the equation is. That question belongs to engineers, mission planners, and the particular, dated, named decisions people make when a price this large lands on a real budget rather than a whiteboard. Every one of the 4 earlier candidates fell to something a careful person could check from a desk. A spacecraft's recorded speed, a law of gravity, a thought experiment involving a ball, and a moving train. This last piece of the puzzle does not sit at a desk. It sits in a meeting room, decades ago, where a decision got made that very nearly ended the whole attempt before a single spacecraft left the ground over a kind of pressure no equation on this list has had to survive. The pressure of a shrinking budget, a shared program, and a choice between a smaller version of the goal and no version at all. It turns out someone did try, decades ago, and the story of how they managed it, and how close they came to never getting the chance at all, says more about what almost impossible actually costs than any delta V figure by itself ever could. Notice too that this is exactly the shape a real answer to a real paradox is supposed to take. Not a single clean number that closes the book, but a number that opens a harder, more human question right behind it. The price explains the difficulty. The difficulty explains why so few have ever attempted it. What is left to explain is what it actually took, in practice, for the ones who did. The story of how anyone ever paid part of that bill starts, unexpectedly, with a discovery that had nothing to do with going up at all. In 1965, a graduate student at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory named Gary Flandreau was studying possible trajectories to the outer planets. Roughly once every 176 years, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune arrange themselves in a configuration that lets a single spacecraft visit all 4, using each planet's own gravity to fling it toward the next. At a fraction of the fuel, a direct series of separate missions would require. That rare alignment was approaching in the late 1970s, and NASA built 2 spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, specifically to use it. The scale of the coincidence is worth sitting with. The last time the outer planets lined up well enough for a tour like this, the United States did not yet exist as a country. The next equally favorable alignment will not arrive again until long after everyone currently alive has died. Flandreau's calculation meant that a single generation of engineers happened to be standing at exactly the right moment in a cycle over a century and a half long, with just enough rocketry and computing power finally in hand to actually use it. A window measured not in launch windows, but in generations. Notice what the Grand Tour actually was and was not. It was an extraordinary demonstration of borrowing momentum from planet to planet. Exactly the technique the last section credited with Voyager's ability to leave the solar system so efficiently. It was not, at any point, an attempt to leave the flattened plane the planets all share. Every planet involved in the Grand Tour lies within a few degrees of that same disk. And every gravity assist Voyager used kept its trajectory close to that disk as well, bending it outward, never upward. The rare alignment that made the Grand Tour possible said nothing about the perpendicular door this whole episode has been circling. But it proved, decisively, that a spacecraft could be sent on an extraordinarily ambitious, multi-planet trajectory if the right planetary geometry happened to exist, which raised an obvious, much harder question for anyone paying attention. Was there a planet capable of bending a trajectory dramatically enough to attempt the other direction, the one no in-plane alignment could ever solve? Flandreau's discovery mattered here for a reason, beyond the missions it directly produced. It established, for the first time with real trajectory calculations behind it, that planetary gravity could be treated as a genuine engineering tool, not a curiosity, not a minor correction, but a deliberate, budgeted substitute for propellant, precise enough to route a spacecraft past 4 planets in sequence and still arrive close enough to each one to matter. Once that tool existed on paper, it was only a matter of time before somebody pointed it at the one direction the Grand Tour itself never touched. Remember, too, how young this entire idea still was at the time. Gravity assists had been theorized in the early 20th century and used in small ways before, but Flandreau's calculation was among the first to show, with real numbers, that a single mission could chain several of them together across an entire outer solar system. The Grand Tour did not simply use an established trick well, it proved the trick scaled far further than anyone had confidently demonstrated before. Among the 8 planets, one so thoroughly outweighs the rest that engineers routinely treat it as its own category. Jupiter contains more mass than all the other planets in the solar system combined, more than twice over. That mass gives its gravity an unusual kind of leverage. A spacecraft passing close enough to Jupiter can have its path bent by tens of degrees in a single flyby, a deflection no other planet comes close to matching without an impossibly close, dangerous pass. That leverage is precisely what the perpendicular problem needed. Cancelling a large fraction of a spacecraft's sideways orbital speed and redirecting the remainder out of the ecliptic plane requires a bend so severe that only Jupiter's gravity, among the available options in the solar system, was strong enough to deliver it in a single pass. Every other planet is either too small to bend a trajectory by more than a few degrees or too close to the Sun to be reached without first correcting course through the very speed the mission is trying to shed. Saturn, the next largest planet, carries less than a third of Jupiter's mass, and the difference shows up directly in how sharply each can bend a passing spacecraft. Saturn's gravity, while still considerable, simply cannot deliver a turn dramatic enough to send something out of the plane in a single encounter the way Jupiter can. That leaves exactly one planet in the entire solar system capable of doing, on the perpendicular problem, what any planet at all could do on the merely outward one. Any mission attempting to go up had exactly one door available to knock on, and that door happened to sit hundreds of millions of kilometers further out than the destination the mission actually cared about, in a direction that had nothing to do with where the spacecraft ultimately needed to arrive. By the start of the 1980s, this single fact, one planet, one usable lever, one narrow window to reach it, had already narrowed an enormous engineering problem down to a single, specific, fundable proposal. It is worth appreciating how unforgiving that narrowing actually was. A mission designer facing the outward problem has an entire outer solar system of planets to choose from, and history arranges itself so that entire fleets of possible trajectories exist through Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in almost any combination. A mission designer facing the perpendicular problem has exactly one candidate, one distance to reach, one encountered geometry to aim for, and no meaningful backup if the numbers do not work out. Ambition, here, had nowhere else to hide. By the early 1980s, mission planners at NASA and the European Space Agency had put these pieces together into an actual proposal. Send a spacecraft to Jupiter first, not to study Jupiter, but to use its gravity as the one lever in the entire solar system strong enough to bend a trajectory out of the plane and finally send something up over the sun's own poles for the first time in the history of spaceflight. The proposal had an appealing simplicity to it on paper. Fly out to Jupiter, let its enormous gravity do in one pass what no amount of fuel could do directly, and let the bent trajectory carry the spacecraft up and over the sun from a vantage nothing had ever occupied before. What the paper version of the plan could not show was how fragile that plan would turn out to be once it met the realities of two space agencies, a shared budget, and the particular year in which the money was due. The original plan was not for one spacecraft. It was for two. NASA and the European Space Agency had agreed, in the late 1970s, to build a spacecraft each for what was then called the International Solar Polar Mission. One launched to pass over the sun's north pole, the other over the south, so that both hemispheres could be studied by instruments arriving from opposite directions at nearly the same time. Two ships, two poles, one shared Jupiter flyby strategy to bend each of them out of the plane. It was ambitious in exactly the way the previous chapters have described. And for a while, it was fully funded on both sides of the Atlantic. Then, in 1981, the numbers stopped cooperating. Facing sharp cuts to NASA's planetary science budget under a new administration in Washington, agency leadership cancelled the American spacecraft outright, keeping only its share of the launch and a set of instruments contributed to the European vehicle. The mission that had been designed around two ships, arriving from two directions, was suddenly reduced to one. And reduced ships do not necessarily still work as science. A single spacecraft could no longer see both poles at once. It would have to choose an orbit that eventually passed near both, one after the other, years apart, accepting a much slower, much less complete picture than the original design had promised. The people who had to make that call were not abstractions. ESA's project scientist for the mission, Richard Marsden, and the engineering and science teams working under him spent the early 1980s deciding whether a single spacecraft, launched alone, could still justify the enormous cost of the one maneuver this entire episode has been building toward. Bending a trajectory out of the plane using Jupiter's gravity, still the only lever in the solar system strong enough to do it. They decided it could. The mission was redesigned around one ship instead of two, renamed Ulysses after the wandering hero of Homer's epic, and sent forward for approval on a budget already half of what it had been designed to need. There was no guarantee, sitting in that room, that a single spacecraft's data would be worth what the mission still cost. Half the promised instruments were gone. Half the promised coverage of the sun's poles was gone with them. A weaker version of this same story, told in a slightly less determined budget meeting somewhere else in the world, ends with the whole mission quietly folded into a cancellation memo, the way dozens of ambitious proposals from that same decade already had been. That is not what happened here. The decision to proceed anyway, to accept a slower, harder, less complete version of an already difficult goal rather than cancel it entirely, is as much a part of why anything has ever gone up as any equation in the chapters before it. Nobody in that room could point to a law of physics that made the choice for them. They made it anyway, on the strength of believing that even one spacecraft's data from over the sun's poles would be worth 2 more decades of a career spent waiting for it. Ulysses left Earth on October 6, 1990, riding inside the cargo bay of the Space Shuttle Discovery on a mission designated STS-41. It was, at launch, one of the smaller spacecraft NASA and ESA had sent anywhere in years. Deliberately light, because everything about its trajectory depended on being pushed as fast as possible on as little mass as possible. To reach the speed the mission needed, Discovery released Ulysses attached to a two-stage combination of solid rocket motors. An inertial upper stage paired with an additional payload assist module, together delivering more energy to a single payload than any expendable upper stage combination the shuttle program had flown before. Ulysses itself weighed only a few hundred kilograms. A deliberately small, deliberately light spacecraft, because every extra kilogram of instrument or shielding would have meant a slightly weaker departure from Earth and a slightly less generous encounter with Jupiter later on. Even with that unusually powerful push, Ulysses could not fly directly toward the Sun's poles. It had to fly outward first, away from the Sun, out to Jupiter, arriving in February 1992, more than a year after launch, heading further from its actual destination before it could begin approaching it at all. Anyone tracking the mission on a simple map of the solar system without knowing the reasoning behind it would have watched a spacecraft built to study the Sun spend its first 16 months traveling steadily away from it. That detour was not a design flaw. It was the entire plan, built around everything the previous chapters have already established. Cancelling the sideways speed needed to leave the plane costs more than almost any direct maneuver could supply, but Jupiter's gravity could supply it instead, for free, provided the spacecraft was willing to fly out to Jupiter's distance first to collect it. Ulysses paid for its trip up by first paying, in time and distance, for a trip out. The same trade every earlier chapter in this hour predicted, now happening to an actual spacecraft on an actual clock, rather than in an idealized accounting on paper. Ground controllers spent that first year and a half tracking a spacecraft that was, by any simple reading of its position, moving in exactly the wrong direction for a mission about the Sunday. Every trajectory update confirmed the same plan working exactly as designed. Further from the target, faster toward the one planet capable of redirecting it, patiently trading distance now for an angle later that no engine on board could ever have purchased directly. None of this required improvisation once the spacecraft was on its way. The entire outbound leg to Jupiter had been calculated years earlier, down to the specific date and distance of the encounter that would eventually bend the trajectory. Ulysses was not searching for its opportunity during that first long year. It was simply falling toward an appointment that had already been fixed on paper before launch. Patiently, the way every falling object in this hour eventually turns out to be. The precision required for that appointment left almost no margin for error. Arrive at Jupiter slightly too close, and the spacecraft risked the planet's intense radiation belts damaging its instruments. Arrive slightly too far, and the bend would fall short of what the mission needed, leaving Ulysses stranded in a compromise orbit that satisfied neither pole. The entire, decades-long payoff of this maneuver depended on a single distance, calculated years in advance and held to within a tolerance most passengers on a commercial flight would never notice missing. On February 8, 1992, Ulysses passed within about 6 Jupiter radii of the giant planet's cloud tops, close enough for Jupiter's gravity to do exactly what no rocket engine on the spacecraft ever could. The flyby bent Ulysses' trajectory by roughly 80 degrees relative to the plane every planet, including Jupiter itself, still orbits within, in a single pass, lasting only hours by the clock, even though the spacecraft had spent well over a year approaching it. Jupiter's gravity cancelled most of the sideways orbital speed Ulysses had carried since leaving Earth, and replaced it with a new heading aimed almost, though not quite, straight up out of the solar system's plane. No engine burn in the mission's entire flight plan came close to producing a change that large. The planet did it for free, the same way it had for Voyager a decade before, except this time the free push was aimed in the one direction gravity assists almost never reach. Scale the encounter to something graspable. Jupiter did not merely nudge Ulysses. It performed, in a matter of hours, the equivalent of cancelling nearly all of the roughly 13 kilometers per second of sideways speed the spacecraft still carried at that distance from the Sun and substituting a new direction almost perpendicular to the old one. A maneuver that would have demanded a rocket stage larger than any Ulysses actually carried had Jupiter not been there to donate the push instead. Nothing about the flyby looked dramatic from the ground. Controllers watched numbers update on a screen, a trajectory curve bend on a plot. Radio signals arrive a little later each day as the distance grew. The actual event, the moment a planet's gravity did to a spacecraft's velocity what no fuel tank on Earth could economically do, produced no flash, no sound, nothing a camera could have usefully framed, even if one had been pointed at it. It simply happened quietly, exactly on schedule, the culmination of a plan first sketched years before a single bolt of the spacecraft existed. A particular kind of satisfaction comes from an event this consequential-looking, this uneventful. The most expensive direction in the solar system was finally being paid for, in real time. And the only visible sign of it was a line on a chart curving a little more steeply than it had the day before, watched by a handful of people in a control room who understood exactly what that small curve actually meant. Nothing about the encounter was undone afterward. Ulysses left Jupiter on a permanently altered path. Still falling around the Sun the way everything in this episode has described, but now falling along a loop tilted dramatically away from the disk, everything else orbits inside. It would take roughly 2 more years, coasting on that bent trajectory, before the spacecraft actually arrived over the Sun's poles. The payoff of a maneuver that took a single afternoon to execute and the better part of 2 decades, from first proposal to final data, to complete. Precision matters here, about what that bend did and did not achieve, because the honest number is more interesting than a rounder, tidier one would be. 80 degrees is not 90. Ulysses tilted dramatically out of the plane that every planet shares, far enough to pass directly over the Sun's poles rather than skimming past them at a distance. But its final orbit still leaned, if only slightly, back toward the familiar disk it had spent a year and a Jupiter flyby trying to escape. A genuinely perfect 90-degree departure, a path with no trace of the original sideways speed left in it at all, would have demanded cancelling essentially all of that inherited motion rather than the very large majority Jupiter actually removed. Even the one mission built specifically to test the most expensive direction in the solar system could not quite pay the entire bill in full. It is the visible remainder of exactly the debt this hour has spent describing, proof that even the single most generous gravitational assist available anywhere in the solar system, applied by the single most massive planet available to use it, still could not fully erase the sideways inheritance every object launched from Earth carries. Jupiter paid most of the bill, nothing paid the rest, and nothing since has tried to. Even at its absolute best, borrowed from the single largest lever the solar system offers, up, still came back owing something, a debt no mission since has volunteered to settle. A tempting way exists to make that shortfall feel smaller than it is. And it is worth resisting. 10 degrees sounds like a rounding error, the kind of gap a slightly larger fuel margin might close on a future mission. It is not. Closing that final 10 degrees would mean cancelling the last remaining sliver of Ulysses's inherited sideways speed directly, with fuel alone, at a cost proportionally larger than almost anything else in this hour, because the cheapest, most available source of free momentum in the entire solar system had already been spent getting this far. Ulysses first crossed high over the Sun's south pole in the middle of 1994, nearly 4 years after leaving Earth, and reached the North Pole roughly a year after that. 2 more comparable passes followed in the mission's second orbit, in 2000 and 2001, before the spacecraft was finally retired in 2009, 19 years after launch, for a maneuver whose defining moment lasted a single pass by Jupiter, and it has happened exactly once. No other spacecraft, before or since, has attempted the specific combination this mission required: a deliberate flight out to Jupiter for the sole purpose of bending sideways into a solar polar orbit. Almost impossible was never a claim that it could not be done. It is a claim about what doing it actually demanded. One uniquely massive planet, one carefully aimed flyby, 19 years of a single spacecraft's working life, and a decision made in a budget meeting rather than a laboratory to attempt a smaller, harder version of the goal rather than none at all. Every subsequent mission that might have repeated the feat has, so far, found a cheaper reason not to. Studying the sun up close, or studying it from directly overhead, turned out to answer different scientific questions, and later solar missions chose the closer, cheaper, in-plane approach instead, accepting a view from the side in exchange for a dramatically smaller fuel bill. The door Ulysses forced open has simply never been walked through again. It would be tidy to end here. A price was named, a mission paid part of it, a bend was achieved, and the door that had never opened before opened, at least partway, exactly once. That is a satisfying enough shape for an answer, and if this were a shorter story about a single spacecraft, it would be a fair place to stop. But the achievement raises a question its own success never actually answered. Ulysses proved that a spacecraft could bend far enough out of the solar system's plane to pass over the sun's poles. It never proved, and was never asked to prove, something that feels like it should follow naturally from that success. Has anyone actually looked back from up there and seen the solar system itself? The flat disk this entire episode has been describing. The way a drone sees a table from above, rather than the way every photograph of it, before or since, has ever been taken. That is not the same question as, has anything gone up? Ulysses answers that one directly, and the answer is yes, once. It is a different, more specific question about vantage and evidence. Given that something has gone up, does a picture exist that was taken from up there, looking back down at the rest of us? It is tempting to assume the answer must be yes, simply because the hard part, the physics, the flyby, the years of coasting, already happened. Achieving a vantage and using it to look are not the same accomplishment, and the gap between them turns out to be its own small, separate story. Think of it the way a person might imagine finally reaching the summit of a mountain no one else has climbed, only to realize the expedition never packed a camera because the entire budget and every kilogram of capacity had been spent getting a working, surviving body to the top at all. The vantage was earned. The photograph was never part of the plan. It would be easy to assume this omission was a short-sighted mistake, the kind a later, wiser mission would obviously correct. The reality is more revealing than that, and it says something honest about how differently seeing and measuring are valued when a spacecraft's entire budget is fighting the same debt this whole episode has been tracking, kilogram by kilogram. From the moment it leaves the launch pad to the moment Jupiter's gravity finally does its work. Whatever the reason, the fact remains plain and a little startling once it is stated outright. Humanity has been up exactly once and came back with magnetic field readings and particle counts rather than a single photograph of home. The view was there for years, waiting the whole time. Nothing on board was ever built to use it. It is worth sitting with how differently this ending would read if it were fiction rather than history. A story would have sent a camera. A story would have closed the loop with a single, breathtaking image of the whole solar system laid out below, the exact reward the setup seems to demand. Reality settled for something quieter and in its own way more honest. A mission that spent everything it had, reaching a place no one had ever occupied, and simply measured what it found there, because measuring was what the budget could still afford once the flight itself was paid for. The honest answer is no, and the reason is stranger than simple distance. Ulysses never carried a camera, Its instruments were built to measure the solar wind, the sun's magnetic field, cosmic rays, and interplanetary dust directly, as particles and fields passing through the spacecraft itself, not to take pictures of anything from a distance. A mission designed at enormous cost to reach one of the strangest vantage points available anywhere in the solar system was never equipped to photograph what it saw from there. Nobody built it a window, because the science it was chasing did not need one. That choice reflects an old, unglamorous truth about how missions actually get built. Every kilogram belongs to whichever instrument fought hardest for it during design, and a camera pointed at an already well-studied disk of planets loses that fight quickly against instruments capable of measuring something no one had ever measured firsthand before. Every image the public has ever seen of the solar system from outside, including the well-known portrait Voyager one took looking back at the planets in 1990, was taken from within a few degrees of the same flat plane every planet already occupies. A view from the side, along the disk, not from above it looking down. No spacecraft has ever carried a wide-field camera far enough above that plane, at a wide enough vantage, to frame the sun and its planets together the way a photograph looks down on a dinner table rather than across it. The one ship that went furthest toward that vantage was listening to the sun's magnetic whispers, not looking at its own neighborhood from outside it. No one has simply added a camera to the next attempt and finished the job. And the reason is not carelessness. Every constraint already described falls on Ulysses' successor exactly as hard as it fell on Ulysses itself. A camera, a wider antenna, extra shielding for the instrument, every added kilogram makes the Jupiter flyby harder to arrange precisely, and the whole mission is already balanced on a single, narrow, unrepeated maneuver. Adding a picture window to a spacecraft built around the most expensive direction in the solar system was never a small request. There is also, quietly, less scientific demand for it than the idea of a photograph from above might suggest. Scientifically, particles and magnetic fields told researchers what they needed to know about the sun's polar behavior. A wide-angle portrait of the disk would have been a remarkable image, but not one any funded proposal has argued is worth the mass, the risk, or the decade of added mission planning it would require. The picture stays unmade for the same reason the trip stays unrepeated. It is not that nobody wants it. It is that wanting it has never yet outweighed what it would cost. So the family portrait of the solar system that so many illustrations and animations casually depict, planets neatly ringed around a bright central sun, viewed from some comfortable, godlike vantage above it all, has never actually been photographed. It exists only as an artist's rendering, built from data gathered entirely from within the plane it is trying to depict. Everything this hour has gathered can now answer the question its title actually asked, in full, without hedging. Going up in the solar system is almost impossible for one underlying reason, arrived at from 5 different directions and confirmed by the one mission that ever tested it directly. Every object born from the sun's collapsing, spinning birth cloud inherited a sideways speed proportional to its distance from the center, and that inheritance was never optional. Earth's share of it is close to 30 kilometers per second, carried by everything and everyone standing on its surface, all the time, without exception. Leaving the solar system outward, along the same flattened plane every planet already shares, barely touches that inheritance. It uses it the way Voyager and New Horizons already have, turning a free gift into a free ride. Leaving that plane perpendicular, truly up, demands giving the gift back first, cancelling nearly all of it before a single kilometre of genuine up progress can begin, and cancelling a speed costs exactly as much as adding one of the same size. There is no direction-blind universe here, no shortage of engines, no shortage of fuel, no failure of aim. There is only a bill, priced in a currency every mission already understands, and up is the most expensive entry on the entire menu. That is not a claim that up is forbidden. Ulysses is the standing proof that it is not. It is a claim about what paying for it actually requires. The single most massive planet available anywhere in reach, a flight plan that spends over a year heading in the opposite direction on purpose, a bend that still fell 10 degrees short of complete, and a decision made by people in a budget meeting rather than a physics department to attempt a diminished version of an enormous goal rather than none at all. Almost impossible has a precise, honest meaning here. It means solvable exactly once, at enormous cost, by borrowing a push from the one body in the solar system large enough to lend it, and left almost entirely untouched by everyone since. Hold the whole shape of the answer at once, because it is simpler than the hour spent reaching it might suggest. Distance was never the enemy. The solar system handed out free rides in every direction that matched the spin it was born with. And outward happens to be one of those directions, which is why Voyager, New Horizons, and every future mission bound for the space between stars can simply accept the gift and go. Up asks for the opposite of a gift. It asks a mission to hand back nearly everything it was given at birth, in the one currency the universe never discounts, before a single kilometer of new progress can begin. Every one of the 5 candidate explanations this hour tested was really just a different shaped attempt to avoid paying that bill. None of them found a discount, because there isn't one. Precision matters, too, for what almost is actually doing in the title of this hour. Almost impossible is not a euphemism for impossible. And the difference matters. Ulysses is not a thought experiment or an unrealized proposal. It flew, it bent, it looked down on the sun's own poles from an angle nothing else in the history of spaceflight has matched. The word almost describes a door that opens only under conditions so specific and so dependent on one uniquely massive neighbor that it has been worth opening exactly once in the entire span of the space age. Set the answer beside the 5 explanations tested to reach it, one final time, because the order they fell in is itself part of the answer. Power fell first, fastest, to 2 spacecraft already outrunning the Sunday fuel fell next, to a technique that had already turned modest propellant into an interstellar trajectory. A lopsided universe fell to a single fact about how gravity behaves around any point mass. Pointing fell to a ball thrown inside a moving train. Borrowing a planet's push fell last and hardest because it came closest to working. Closest, in fact, to actually solving the problem, before the geometry of a flattened disk closed off every angle except one. Each failure removed a more sophisticated wrong answer than the one before it. The way a good detective story removes suspects in order of how convincingly each one could have done it. A deeper way exists to hold everything this hour has assembled. One that has less to do with rockets than with the particular kind of motion nobody standing anywhere in this solar system was ever handed. Every direction that has ever been cheap to travel in, outward toward Jupiter, outward past Pluto, outward into the dark between stars, happens to be a direction that lets a traveler keep what it was born with. The cloud that became the sun and its planets was already spinning before any of this began, and everything that condensed out of it inherited a share of that spin as a kind of birthright distributed by distance from the center, like an inheritance divided among children according to how far they stood from the estate. Speed handed down for free, never earned, never chosen, and never something a traveler needs to fight as long as it keeps moving in roughly the direction that speed already points. Up was never blocked by distance. Voyager already proved distance negotiable decades ago, using exactly the inheritance every launch carries. Up was never blocked by engine power, either. The same machines that prove distance negotiable prove power is not the limiting resource. What blocks up is something closer to a debt owed to your own origin. A form of motion the solar system's birth guaranteed nothing born inside it would ever need, because everything inside it was already moving the other way before it had a choice in the matter. There is something almost gentle in framing it this way, rather than as a simple failure of engineering. Nothing about the solar system withheld up out of malice or design. The flattened disk was simply the shape a spinning cloud of gas was always going to collapse into. 4.5 billion years before anyone existed to want a different one, and every object condensing out of that disk was handed the same inheritance without exception. Up was never forbidden. It was simply never included in the instructions, because nothing that ever needed to travel that way was ever born expecting to. Consider what it would take for a different solar system, somewhere else, to have made up the easy direction instead. It would need a birth cloud with no net spin at all, collapsing evenly in every direction rather than flattening into a disk, an arrangement physically possible in principle, and vanishingly rare in practice, because almost every cloud of gas large enough to form a star system carries at least some rotation left over from the larger, turbulent nebula it condensed out of. The flatness humanity was born into was never guaranteed by any law demanding it specifically. It was simply the overwhelmingly likely outcome of ordinary physics, acting on an ordinary cloud. The same physics that would flatten almost any other star system into the same familiar disk, given enough time and enough patience. That is a strange thing to be true of an entire region of space, 4.5 billion years old, and stranger still that it applies just as completely to a person as to a spacecraft. You did not choose your inherited sideways speed any more than Earth did, any more than Ulysses did before Jupiter finally offered it a different direction to spend that speed in. The solar system built a flat, spinning plate, and everything born on that plate, planets, moons, rocket fuel, and the body reading or listening to this sentence, was handed the same instruction without ever being asked. Keep moving sideways, the way everything around you already does, and up will simply never come up as a requirement because nothing in your inheritance was ever aimed that way. There is a particular kind of vertigo available to anyone willing to sit with that fact for a moment rather than move past it. Every direction that has ever felt effortless. Walking forward, standing still, even a rocket appearing to climb straight up off a launch pad, has felt that way only because it moves along, or barely against, the same inherited sideways current everything around it shares. The one direction that would require fighting that current directly rather than riding it is also the one direction almost nothing in 4.5 billion years of solar system history has ever needed to travel. Ease and inheritance turn out to be the same thing, wearing different names. Perhaps that is the plainest way to hold the whole hour at once. Difficulty was never a property of distance, and ease was never a property of nearness. Both were always a property of debt. How much of what you were born with has to be handed back before the universe will let you go somewhere it never expected you to need to go? That reframing travels further than rockets. Every steep problem, examined closely enough, tends to separate into the part that is genuinely hard and the part that only looks hard because it is approached against an inheritance rather than with one. Up was never impossible the way a law of physics forbids something outright. It was expensive, the way fighting an inheritance is always expensive. Easy to miss from the ground. Impossible to miss once you have watched one spacecraft try to pay the bill in full. Return, one last time, to the picture that opened this hour. A rocket lifting off the ground, its smoke trail rising straight and bright, looking for all the world like it is simply going up. Nothing about that image was wrong to notice. It was only ever incomplete. The vertical trail is real, and it is also the cheapest, briefest phase of the entire flight. A minute or two of climbing, spent before the vehicle tips over and begins the actual, expensive, decades-tested work of matching the sideways speed a stable orbit requires. Every launch you have ever watched has performed this same quiet substitution in front of you. Up, offered first because it is what the eye expects, replaced almost immediately by sideways because sideways is what actually works. There is something almost affectionate in returning to that image now, knowing everything it was quietly hiding. The rocket was never lying. It genuinely does go up. For a minute, exactly the way it looks like it should. The trick was never in the rocket's honesty. It was in how much of the real story that first minute was ever going to be able to tell. A fraction so small that an entire episode was needed to fill in the rest. And even now, the rest is still only a fraction of what a longer look could find. Every rocket launch broadcast ever produced has, without meaning to, been showing this same lesson to anyone paying close enough attention. The bright vertical column climbing off the pad is also the part that costs the least and explains the least about where the vehicle is actually going. The real story starts exactly where the picture stops looking like up and starts looking, to an untrained eye, like the rocket is somehow failing to climb as steeply as it should. It is not failing. It is finally succeeding in the only direction that was ever going to work. Think back one more time to the very first image this hour offered. A small, violent light climbing away from the thing that made it, like a match held still against the dark. That match was never wrong about where it was going. It was only ever silent about how briefly up was going to last, and how much of the actual journey still waited. Picture that same trail now with everything this hour has added to it. The rocket is not fighting to escape a hole. It is joining a plate already spinning, already carrying an inheritance of speed that arrived with the ground it launched from, long before any engine was designed to add to it, going further out along that plate, to Mars, to Jupiter, to the dark beyond every planet, has been a solved problem for half a century, because it only ever asked a mission to keep something it already had. Going up off that plate asked something almost nothing in the solar system's 4.5 billion year history has ever been asked to do. Give the inheritance back first. One spacecraft did, once, borrowing the push from the one planet massive enough to lend it, and came home 10 degrees short of finishing the job, with no photograph of the view it earned. The next time a launch broadcast shows that familiar column of fire and smoke rising against the sky, the vertical trail will mean something different than it used to. Watch for the moment it starts to lean, almost apologetically, away from straight up, the pitch program doing, in full view of anyone watching closely, the same quiet work this entire hour has been describing. It is not a flaw in the footage. It is the one honest glimpse most people ever get of the actual shape of the debt every object leaving this planet is already carrying and already beginning to spend. Somewhere in that lean is the entire distance between the two directions this hour has spent comparing. Outward is the direction the lean is already helping the rocket reach, a debt the flight barely notices paying because the money was never really its own to begin with. Up is the direction the lean is quietly refusing, chapter after chapter, launch after launch, for exactly as long as spaceflight has existed. One spacecraft once refused the lean back and spent 19 years, one irreplaceable planet, and an entire career's worth of patience doing it. Wherever you are lying right now, still is not what your body is actually doing. The room around you, the bed underneath you, the walls holding both in place are all being carried, this instant, at close to 30 kilometers per second around a star you cannot currently see, on a plate of spinning material older than any mountain on Earth's surface. You have never felt that speed, and you never will, the same way a passenger asleep on a smooth flight never feels the aircraft's motion at all. It simply has nowhere to push against. The way falling has nowhere to push against, which is the same quiet fact this entire hour turned out to be about. Everyone you have ever known has shared that same inheritance without exception, carried at the same speed, on the same tilted plate, toward no particular destination beyond another year around the same star. It is easy to mistake stillness for the absence of motion. Tonight, at least, you know better. You are moving, constantly, generously, in the one direction the universe has always been willing to give away for free. There is no up waiting outside your window tonight. No direction the ceiling secretly leads toward that would cost less than the floor. There is only the plate, turning, carrying you the same way it carries every planet, every rock, every spacecraft that has ever bothered to leave. Sideways, patiently, without asking permission, the one direction that has never once been almost impossible. The rocket that opened this hour is still climbing somewhere in memory. Still bright. Still briefly honest about the one direction it was ever going to need for the first minute of its life. Let it climb. The rest of the story was always sideways. And so, gently, are you? Let the rest of tonight belong to that direction. Not up, not away, not escape. Simply the long, generous, inherited sideways drift that has carried everything you have ever loved, everything you have ever known, and the ground currently holding you up, around the same star, on the same plate, since before any of it had a name for what it was doing. Somewhere above the ceiling, farther than any camera has ever looked back from, the disk you are part of keeps turning the same way it always has, indifferent to whether anyone below is awake to notice. It does not need you to understand it to keep carrying you. It has been doing that, without asking, for longer than there has been anyone here to ask it to stop. Let it keep doing exactly that. There is nothing left tonight that needs solving. No direction left to test. No bill left unnamed. Only the plate, and the speed, and the quiet, ordinary miracle of being carried by both without ever having to ask how. The universe will still be here when you wake up. So will we. Good night. So the honest status of the question, decades after the one attempt this episode has followed, is not solved and not abandoned. It remains open, for a reason that has nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with the same arithmetic this whole hour has been assembling. It is a rare kind of unfinished business in modern space exploration, a gap left open not by a failed attempt, but by a successful one that was never asked to close it. Most unanswered questions in this field wait on better telescopes, longer missions, or discoveries not yet made. This one waits on nothing more exotic than a future mission planner deciding that a picture, finally, is worth the same enormous price every earlier chapter of this hour has already named.